Hello, Sublation Media viewers and potential future readers. You're about to watch an interview I did with Simon Critchley about his book Bald. But I wanted to let you know that if you become a patron, you'll also be getting early access to an interview Alfie Bound did with Gilla Kricic. That would be the novelist Gilla Kricic, who is perhaps best known in these circles as being the wife of Slavoj Žižek, but who is a literary giant in her own right and who Alfie recently interviewed for our channel. So if you would like to get early access to that interview, become a patron. Right now, you're about to watch Simon Critchley, and thanks for watching.
I've just rearranged my office. I've been delaying it for months. It's the first time I've seen the Zoom screen in the new office, which has got this white wall and a blue wall, which is
I like it. It looks good. It looks like a professional set. You're in some sort of modernist wonderland behind you somehow. Just the monochromic.
I'm in the middle of Midtown, which is quite exciting to see.
Oh yeah! Look at that! Wow! Wow! If I panned around, you'd just see my dirty laundry on the floor.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right, so you are the moderator of the New York Times Stone column and the author of numerous books on everything from Greek tragedy to David Bowie. Simon Critchley has been a strong voice in popular philosophy for more than a decade, and his book Bald, 35 Philosophical Shortcuts, brings together 35 essays originally published in the Times on a wide range of topics, from the dimensions of Plato's Academy to Philip K. Dick, Mormonism, money, and the joy and pain of the Liverpool Football Club fans. Simon Critchley, welcome to the Sublation Media channel and to the Diet Soap podcast.
Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really glad to. I'm just going to start off with a really obvious question. Why is your book entitled Bald? Or how does baldness run through? Well, yes, I mean,
the answer.
Oh, by the way, today, the question of being bald is a hot topic because of what happened at the Oscars last night. I don't know if you want to say at the outset whether you're Team Smith or Team Rock. Perhaps Rock. Not. Oh, you're Team Rock. Me too.
Team Rock. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's, good Lord. Where do we start? I am. Yeah. So it's called Bald because I am bald. That's funny. And then it's a bald in the sense of being bald and bold and speaking, frankly, without academic toupees and wigs and various devices to try and speak plainly.
Yeah, it's always risky to speak plainly. And I don't know if you know too much about this channel or the history, but I used to work for a critical theory imprint called Zero Books, which was out of the UK. And we would get many submissions from academics and PhD students where it seemed like the goal was to make their points as obscurely as possible. And being relatively versed in critical theory, I could, if I made an effort, I could often decode what was being said. Mm-hmm. And once I did that, I realized why they were trying to obscure what they were saying, because it often didn't make sense. But if you trying to write baldly, do you find that to be more difficult than, because you're academically trained, you know the realm of philosophy fairly well? Does it make you, do you have to take longer to write an essay when you're writing as plainly as possible?
Yes, yeah. It means, it really means that you have to write for an audience, and then you have to write. I mean, what I really learned. I mean, in a sense, I'd learned some of this early on, but what I really learned was how to work with an editor. So the every word in this book, Bald, has been through the editorial lens of Peter Catapano, who is my New York Times editor, and it's been a fight, and usually where he was right, and I had to not submit to his will, that's exaggerating it, but accept his better judgment. And so you learn to that's a humbling experience. And you, of course, I always think that if I've written something, that will do. And then you discover that actually, no, you've got to twist this around and accept a whole series of compromises. But it makes the writing sharper, cleaner. And so in a sense, it's a humbling experience. Let's put it that way. I mean, so I think a lot of the problem with academic writing is that people don't have editors and they don't have a sense of an audience, and they have some maybe misguided sense of speaking loftily or speaking in a kind of highfalutin way, as people would say here. And sometimes they have a point to make and they can't make it clearly. Sometimes they don't have a point to make and they're just speaking obscurely to just disguise that. So the easiest way to find out is whether you can speak plainly. And I try not to be dumbed down. There's nothing in the book that's dumbed down, but it is addressed without jargon. Without jargon.
Yeah, that's something that I run up against all the time, because I write fiction, but I also write essays for this channel, and trying to write as plainly as possible and to make things as accessible as possible without dumbing things down, or the real way to think about that is oversimplifying, sometimes conflating ideas that shouldn't be conflated, or allowing for what is kind of common sense to step in where really what you want to do is fight against the common sense understanding. It's all very tricky, and it has to do, I think, with being philosophical about when you're writing. I mean, you are a popular philosopher. This makes to do philosophy baldly, and to try to popularize not only the ideas of other philosophers but your own ideas. It would be, I think, a tricky situation. But to start with, how do you view what the realm of philosophy in the public, or doing it publicly, or what is it to be a philosopher in your position today?
Well, first, I never think of myself as a philosopher. I think of myself as someone that teaches philosophy, or more accurately, teaches in a philosophy department. And I began in literature and with interest in literature and political theory, and I just found my way to philosophy because the teachers were better. There was less to read in a way, and I could read it more carefully. So I enjoyed reading shorter texts very, very intensely. So there's that. And I always thought that for very good philosophical readings, philosophical reasons, that Hegel says philosophy is its time comprehended in thought, and I think that is the task of philosophy, to comprehend our time in thought and to intervene in culture. That philosophy shouldn't be an academic activity alone. It has to be in part an academic activity, but not an academic activity alone. And it should speak to the conditions of the culture. So I've always thought that's the task of philosophy. So how do you do that? And then I guess the chance with the stone as it developed over the years, well, at the beginning rather, and this is kind of the trick of fate, is that we began when there was a newspaper called the New York Times, the print edition, that was the real thing, and then there was a website. And newspapers needed a website, but nobody cared about the website. And so there was great freedom on that website. So we began to develop the ideas for the stone. We launched it, and then we developed. We found we had an audience, and then as the technology shifted from the print newspaper to the digital newspaper, which has now completely happened, and the print edition is now, it's a nice thing to have at the weekend, a nice, you feel like a nostalgic sense of looking at a newspaper, but people follow the news online. So we were there as that transition was happening from 2009 through to the last couple of years. And we were, to that extent, I mean, that wouldn't happen again. And indeed, the stone has been, is on hiatus because the idea of a series doesn't fit now with how the New York Times have organized their opinion section. I mean, who knows? We might be back in some form in the future, but we don't quite fit. So it's but I think it's the responsibility of people interested in philosophy to address the public and to do that in ways that are not patronizing and dumbed down. To I retain a belief that ordinary people are not stupid, are pretty decent and well informed, and if you can talk to them in terms that they understand, you can get a point across. So for example, the stone began, and the book, although it's somewhere in the middle of the book, there's a piece called "What is a Philosopher?" So rather than beginning with "What is philosophy?"
That's what I was trying to ask you at the beginning of this question, was like, what is a philosopher? Who are you as a philosopher?
Well,
right?
Socrates has got, I mean, this is what I like to do. This is kind of the high-low line that I like to walk. So the first column in the stone, which is somewhere in the middle of the book, is called "What is a Philosopher?" And it's about a passage, a few pages in the Greek text, 8 pages or so, that's called the digression. It's a digression in a dialogue called the Theaetetus, which is a very difficult dialogue on perception. But there's this digression. It's called a digression because scholars haven't been able to work out what it really means. But in this digression, called a digression, Socrates talks about philosophers. And he begins with the story of Thales, the first philosopher from Miletus on the present-day Turkish coast, who falls into a ditch or falls into a bit of ground because he's looking at the sky, looking at the heavens, and a Thracian servant girl laughs at him. And so philosophy begins with a fool, begins with someone appearing to be a fool. So it's the fall of a fool, and the philosopher is a ridiculous figure, a comic figure who falls into ditches and makes an idiot of himself. So what is a philosopher? A philosopher, in a sense, is a kind of public fool who will say things that other people will hesitate to say. And the price for that, for Socrates, is death. He gets executed by his city of Athens. So I don't think you should shy away from the idea of philosophy as an inherently kind of comic position. It is a really, so Socrates makes a contrast between the lawyer who, or what he calls the pettifogger, the lawyer or the pettifogger who speaks to the clock and who gets paid according to the clock for their time, and the philosopher who takes time and can't speak in accordance with the clock and can't speak in a court of law, and therefore gets tried and found guilty and executed by the city of Athens. So the philosopher is a fool, a comic figure, and someone who takes time. And that's important. Someone who, in a sense, is at leisure, in a sense, and who can ponder these larger, slightly peculiar questions about the nature of existence and so on and so forth. And there's no need for that. We don't need philosophers. Society can function perfectly well without them. But in my view, it's diminished if that happens.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. I'm interrupting this interview with Simon Critchley to tell you about GCAS and a seminar that's coming up with Christopher Hedges and Boris Franklin. This seminar, which will include the book Our Class Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison by Chris Hedges, and the play Caged, written by the New Jersey Prison Theater Cooperative, will examine the transformative power of education and creative self-expression in prison. Again, that starts on May 2nd. It's the first session. GCAS is our only sponsor on this channel, and them stepping forward to help us out by being a sponsor made a big difference as we came together to create Sublation Media. So I would appreciate it if you're interested in what they're doing for you to check them out. I'll put a link to GCAS in the description of this video and in the show notes for the podcast, and you can take a look at not just this seminar, but what they're doing overall in the coming year. There's a pretty popular philosopher around today named Slavoj Žižek who says that philosophy comes into its own in moments where society can't function that well without it. Like, you suddenly find that philosophy becomes more popular when the everyday functioning of society is in question. Yep. And I feel that that in the last, let's say, couple of decades, since 9/11, but certainly probably before that even, there's been a feeling that there's a need for philosophy amongst some people. And to listen to you describe it, that means that there's a need for people to allow themselves to appear foolish.
Yep.
And to not instantly have an answer.
Yeah. And Žižek, Žižek, although I've had fights with him over the years, been quite nasty fights, but they're not personal fights about, philosophical positions and political positions and kind of gloves off fights. But, it's not, I respect his position, and he's also funny, particularly when he's talking about film. He's really good when he's talking about movies, I think, but not to diminish his contribution. But I think that the idea of, there's a couple of things, I suppose. Firstly, philosophy in Plato appears, that word appears at a moment when democracy, which is the form of government that the Athenians invented based on this idea of equality, when democracy is in a kind of decay, in an imperial decay. Athens has become an empire, they've lost their way, philosophy appears. So the idea of philosophy appearing at moments when democracies are called into question and calling themselves into question makes sense, firstly. And secondly, I think that has the internet been a good or bad thing for human beings? We could discuss that for hours, and I don't really have a strong view one way or the other. But it has been terrible for certain things. It's been bad for novels, but it's been good for philosophy, and it's been good for the fact that you can find out, what things mean, what people have said. Wikipedia is a fantastically kind of able resource. And you can also find, someone like Žižek, you can find tons of things, videos and short texts and bits and pieces. So there's a sense in which the kind of gobbet-based culture that we've moved into, the kind of fragment-based culture that we kind of live off and we think of as the real world, is better suited to philosophy than, let's say, long form fiction, or indeed, complex forms of modernist poetry, which is the stuff that I grew up with. So so to that extent, it's not a bad time for philosophy.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. As I actually am a novelist. I've written 3 novels, and I've written a lot of short fiction. And but I also majored in philosophy as an undergraduate, and ended up doing philosophy in some sort like through this channel, and through publishing somewhat professionally. And it came about, and as of my desire to be a extremely successful novelist died. I mean, I'm still planning on publishing more fiction. But why do you think it is that the internet, and rather than say television or movies, has been bad for novels?
For novels, I mean, it's just a question of long form reading, and that people just it began to happen in the 80s, I think, and then I think at a certain point, certainly in a country like Britain in the early 90s, it was complete. The shift from fiction writers as being the center of culture to, say, contemporary artists as being the kind of centers of culture. That just happened, and the strange phenomenon of people queuing up all day to go to Tate Modern and see whatever new exhibition by whatever new artist, and that being the new form of cultural currency. And it didn't really matter if you'd read the books on the Booker Prize shortlist or not. So it's just it's a cultural shift, and the novel was the center of culture for a few hundred years, depending on how you count it, from, let's say, Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year through to, I don't know, Satanic Verses. And it's just not anymore. And people have enormous difficulty reading long form pieces. And that's a real problem. I mean, I grew up reading when I could, spending, I don't know, 7-8 hours a day reading Penguin classics that I thought were good for my soul, books like Don Quixote or whatever it might have been, because it was just, that's what I thought an education was, and I thought that was cool. And that, that amount of time just, also study has changed, that the students used to be kind of, interesting layabouts, and you would have time to kind of mull things over and do classes, and there was a sense in which you took time, right? And that, whereas you talk to, say, undergraduates now, and they're doing their classes, they're doing internships, they're working in coffee bars, they're constantly busy. So asking them to read a 300-page book for next week's class, it's just not going to happen. So, for example, I teach a class right now on Shakespeare's Hamlet, and for graduates and undergraduates. And for the undergraduates, we just read the play out loud in class. That's really what we're doing. We're reading the play out loud in class and trying to understand the verse and how it is that Shakespeare makes sense through sound, and, how it's working at the level of prosody and the significance of the play. And the students really like that. But we're doing that work in class. Because if I say, read these 40 pages of text and then come in and discuss it, it just ain't going to happen. Some of them will do it, but most of them won't. So, I think it's a real problem with how people fill their time. And, there is the great joys of life used to be just staring blankly at a wall and thinking about nothing in particular, and then seeing what might come up. And that doesn't happen now because we've got these things.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. If you have a spare moment and nothing's happening, you fill it by looking at your phone and finding out what's happening all over the social media or where have you. It strikes me that the last time, and perhaps this example is the only example, and it doesn't really, the idea of this doesn't exist or never really existed. But from my perspective, as someone who's a member of Generation X, the last time there was a novel that was kind of aimed at or defined a generation was Douglas Coupland's Generation X. Like, it seemed to me that the novelist would step forward, and every 10 years or so, someone would have written a book that people would hold up. Maybe there'd be 2 or 3 as definitive of the sensibilities of a generation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there has been a novel that filled that function since Generation X. I perhaps I'm missing it. But
well, I mean, it's I mean, to put in a word for, I mean, someone who well, this also makes the point. A really good friend of mine is Tom McCarthy, and we've worked together for years and years and years. And we used to run an organization together, and blah blah blah. We're really close. His novel Remainder, which I remember I read that in around 2001. It wasn't published till years later because he couldn't find a publisher. And anyway, but that seemed to capture a certain kind of conceptual moment. But by that time, when I was doing stuff with Tom, we were doing it in galleries and in little art spaces and weird little corners of London and elsewhere, where it was fine to just talk about literature. And all the entire project that me and Tom had was completely literary. It was all steeped in Joyce and Shakespeare and different people. But somehow that had passed out of the academy and into the world of art, and that's no longer available because the art world has become increasingly kind of bureaucratized and politicized, and so that's not, so you're looking for free spaces to think in, and I mean, I guess they're in short supply, but I remain hopeful that that philosophy is something which strangely has survived this enormous kind of second or third Gutenberg transformation that we've been through. It's survived it pretty much intact. Not intact, but it's survived it quite well in ways in which the study of literature or even things like sociology, say, have not really survived in the same way. So I think that's good for business, I guess. And also the pandemic. I mean, awful, terrible, horrible, all of that. But on the other hand, there you had, millions and millions and millions of people who were forced back onto their heels and asked to face up to the questions of existence in a way that perhaps they have been evading for the previous parts of their lives. And that was a very philosophical moment, I think. And I hope that doesn't go away, because some deep, important stuff came out of that. People were kind of really, I found things like, like the Great Resignation, as it was called, actually really interesting, that people were really thinking about why they should work, what that means, and whether they should carry on doing it or not. And so I think that so philosophy is in reasonable shape.
Yeah, you bring up the pandemic in that way. Reminds me of something you wrote in your book about anxiety. Anxiety being maybe the driver of philosophy, or at least anxiety becomes a driver towards freedom, I think you say. And it seems to me that the idea that you can be someone who is allowed to be foolish in public and take your time doing so would require, at least today, I think that person would have to be free. And in our world, you'd have to be perhaps really anxious about the world as it is in order to risk philosophy. Do you think that the pandemic created the kind of anxiety that will lead people, or has led people to be more philosophical, or is it generating just more of a drive for simple answers and
well, maybe both. I mean, we want simple answers in the sense in which we want, a cure, we want a vaccine, we want help, and also I think it awakened all sorts of really archaic human material. What it means to be in a society, what it is to kind of really fear for your existence and fear for the existence of those around you who you love. And I think all sorts of people. I taught a class called Pandemic Mysticism this time last year, and I've been working on mysticism in the last few years, and maybe we'll talk about that at some future point. But it's interesting to me how people had really strange experiences in lockdown, strange kind of borderline experiences, and all sorts of feelings that were considered to be archaic or superstitious or out of date were sort of revived, and there was a need for that to find some expression, which could be kind of religious on the one hand. So there's that. With regard to philosophy, I at my core, I'm an existentialist, and I don't mind admitting it. I mean, existentialism for me was the way in, and the one thing that really hit me when I was a student was the distinction between fear and anxiety. And fear is fear of something. Fear has an object, and if you remove the object, you remove the fear. So if you're scared of badgers, say, and a badger shows up, like in my office now, and I go, oh, there's a badger, I'm terrified. And then somebody takes the badger away, I'm relieved. Anxiety does not have an object. Anxiety is generalized. So anxiety is about nothing in particular. Anxiety is about the general condition of existence. So in that sense, grasping that anxiety that you're feeling is actually what makes you human and what makes you a free human is, it's immensely liberating, as well as being, one suffers a bit, but I think philosophy has to come out of an experience of suffering. That's another thing I think is very important, that philosophy is not a kind of a technically sharpened common sense. It's not something you get if you get the right, education you can do. It's philosophy has to come out of a kind of visceral, existential set of experiences, and in particular a sense of suffering, and then you can give voice to that with philosophy. And so the philosophers that most resonate with me are those that have given voice to that experience of suffering. People like in the last piece in the book, I talk about Pascal, where he's talking about anxiety, wretchedness, boredom, and the inability to sit quietly in a room as really what defines the human condition. And so I think that just that thing alone, that you can take someone's anxiety, the anxiety that someone's feeling, and Lord knows that's there's a lot of that around, and not just diagnose it, not just medicate it, but to use it as a kind of liberatory mechanism with which you can kind of push back onto the world, I think is something that philosophy can give voice to. And I wish there were, I think the pandemic opened that, but we're desperate to close it back down because it was a little bit alarming.
Yeah. Well, another moment that you write about in your book, which was a moment of anxiety for many, I think for everyone in really, was the moment, was 2016. It was when the Brexit vote happened. It was when Trump was elected. And in your essay, you talk about how Trump created a reality where everything is a conspiracy, everything is rigged, where nowhere and no one is safe.
Yeah.
And that seems to me like a description of a world of anxiety. Only, I guess the fact that he talked about that he set it up as a conspiracy means that it was really a world of fear, as you describe it, rather than a world of anxiety. And today we're in a world where, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I'm experiencing a fear of the old Cold War type coming back, the fear of
Yep.
a nuclear Armageddon.
Mhm.
And this notion that everything is rigged and no one is safe is ever present. I have people who are friends of mine on Facebook who are part of the kind of right-wing QAnon types who will be messaging me about the latest conspiracy theory that they have and trying to get me on board with it.
Yes.
What I do notice is that what's missing is not fear but anxiety, the feeling that there's that they don't know.
Yeah, so I think conspiracy theories are very interesting because I think they're registering an anxiety, but then they're also diagnosing it. There's an answer. There's a this is why this is happening. So I think I see. I mean, the piece I wrote on I think it's called Brexistentialism. I wrote that. I think it was published the day before Trump was elected, but it was, I don't know. I mean, it was. Anyway, it happened, and a book that I've been reading in the last month, which I'd recommend very, very strongly to anybody out there, is a book called Putin's People by someone called Catherine Belton, which came out, I think, last year or the year before, and it is a forensic analysis of how Putin came to power and the structures of power that he put in place in financial terms. She's a financial journalist. And she shows how that Russian money got around and how it went to Liechtenstein and Geneva and most of all to London, and how Russian money kind of infiltrated itself into the elite in London, and then the effects that it had in the United States, in particular on Trump. So it's not that Trump was in bed with with Putin. It didn't need to be, but in order to borrow money, in order to salvage his bankrupt enterprises, the money came from those sources. So it's the way in which what's happening with Russia now, in a sense, it's too late. Russia has undermined, infiltrated the West through money since the early 1990s, and we're just really kind of waking up to that and deciding whether we want to go with that or not, and whether say a country like Germany is going to be serious with, trying to limit or eliminate oil and gas from Russia economically, and what the consequences of that are going to be. But the wider point, I think, is that the Trump world, the conspiracy world, the world where everything is a fraud, where everything is rigged, and where you are constantly having the sense of being tricked, but you're in on the joke. That world is a world of fear, which is a way in which people are controlled. It seems to me. It seems to me that the world of if you like, Trump world and Putin world, are a world where we inhabit something like what Tarkovsky called the zone in his
Stalker.
In Stalker, where in a sense reality can be bent and skewed, and the normal rules that govern the behavior of things no longer apply. Down is up, up is down. If you make a statement like Russia will make a statement, Russia will withdraw from Ukraine, and then they don't withdraw from Ukraine, or you say, well, invade Ukraine, and they'll do the opposite. So the idea that you can control things through chaos, I think is really powerful, and that is one of the, as it were, the theatrical, fictional mechanisms that Putin has deployed, and that has been echoed, amplified by largely by the right in the United States in all sorts of witting and unwitting ways. And I mean, then the question is, well, where are we now? As David Bowie would have said, are we have we kind of sobered up, and has Putin inadvertently rallied the West, in quotation marks, and NATO, and what used to be called the free world, and then we're gonna finally push through this. I don't know. We'll see. It's a very interesting and unpredictable moment. I didn't think that the Russians were going to go into Ukraine. Firstly, I was surprised when it happened, and I thought it would end very differently. So I'm also surprised by what's happened in the last month, and then the consequence of that, Lord only knows. I tend to defer to people like Masha Gessen, whose views are very sober, but pretty in the best case scenario is really not that good, and that's probably what we're.
Yeah. Well, what I find myself, I mean, maybe this is a sign of my age now, and also my just a certain kind of denialism that's in my character. But I find myself thinking back to 1991 right now, and after, and asking like what went wrong in the process of trying to bring the former Soviet Union, Russia, and the satellite states into a system of democratic, cooperation and mutual, at least trade, if not mutual aid. The idea was that eventually Russia would be part of NATO. That the idea was that there would be no need for competition about spheres of influence in a world without huge ideological differences. And yet, without ideological differences, we're now facing the same threat of mutual assured destruction as we would have been in the 60s and throughout the Cold War. So I find it extremely discouraging and a real indictment of the West and the whole global system, that this is happening, that this is going on.
People, I think you have to begin from. There was a wonderful documentary by Errol Morris called "The Fog of War," 2003, 4, something like that, and it was mainly interviews with Robert McNamara, who for the left in the United States was kind of the Satan incarnate who administered the bombing program and the military expansion in Vietnam, so on and so forth. But Errol Morris engages in these very interesting discussions with McNamara. And McNamara says the first rule of war is sympathy with the enemy. The first rule of war is sympathy with the enemy. And I think we have to have sympathy with the enemy if the enemy is Russia, and therefore see things in their terms. And the West's arrogance, its sense in which the Cold War was over, and the West had won, and Russia was a kind of regional and unimportant power, and the kind of the way in which that disrespect of Russia led to resentment, and then ever more increasing resentment, and the idea that the West was really out to get Russia, which is incredibly strong, it seems to me, as a mobilizing premise for Putin. And you combine that with patriotism, which is an extraordinarily powerful force, which doesn't seem to be going away, and in the Russian case, terribly powerful. And you combine that with orthodoxy, with Orthodox Christianity, which of course was dead and buried. I remember being in Moscow once, and on the site of, I forget the name of there's a great cathedral there was a cathedral in the middle of Moscow. It was demolished under Stalin, I think, and they built a swimming pool, and then they rebuilt the cathedral in the 1990s, and it's where the Pussy Riot process took place in Moscow. Anyway, but patriotism, orthodoxy, and a deep suspicion of the enemy, and a sense in which we're going to get them because they didn't respect us. And unless you understand the world in Putin's terms, you're not going to get anywhere, it seems to me. So the vilification of Russia, the vilification of Putin as evil or a madman or whatever, that's not helpful at all. This is a coherent vision of the world, deeply flawed but coherent, and it has to be understood in its own terms. And so
Yeah. The other person that I think I want to talk to you about it with your book, and we only have a few minutes left, but I want to touch on this topic is Philip K. Dick.
Okay.
Who's one of my very favorite writers. I would say maybe my favorite science fiction writer. Someone who, in many ways, in my own writing, I've tried to emulate. But you are critical of Philip. I mean, you obviously love his work, but you do point to his paranoia,
yes,
and to his Gnosticism, as sort of maybe even lining up, if you read your book in a certain way, with the kind of conspiracy thinking that that Trump pushed out into the world. And I wonder if there's a more radical Philip K. Dick that people might be able to hold on to as well, even though I think he himself fluctuated back and forth between being a rather reactionary figure and being a more liberatory. But one of the things that Philip K. Dick said that I think is useful is he said the ultimate in paranoia is not when everyone is against you, but when everything is against you. Instead of my boss is plotting against me, it would be my boss's phone is plotting against me. Objects seem to possess a will of their own anyhow to the normal mind. They don't do what they're supposed to do. They get in the way. They show an unnatural resistance to change and so on. But I thought, you read that line from Philip K. Dick, and I'm not sure if that was in a book or in a lecture that he gave, but that sounds a little bit like Marx to me. Like we live in a world where our social relationships are mediated by things and our own activity, and the relationship between these things is mediated by our own activity. You know, so
the commodity in Marx, right? As having a life. Right? He talks about the kind of the magic dancing table is not just an object; it's alive, or the way in which a car will be alive. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So things have an agency. Yeah. Go on.
I just think that to be more paranoid, it's like what we don't want to ask someone like Philip K. Dick to be is less reactionary, less paranoid, less anxious. We want to say, oh yeah, you're actually hedging your bets here. You need to be more paranoid, like at your best self, the most paranoid stuff.
Right. That's good. Yeah, I mean, I think it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a dickhead as they.
I've been called a dickhead in many contexts,
right? And it's but I admire Philip K. Dick enormously, and I think he saw something about the deep pattern of reality and where it was going in his fiction, and in a sense, he did predict the future in ways in which maybe no other writers have done, and that kind of dystopian turn in his work. But I don't want to dismiss it at all. I don't think it's just. I think the pieces that I write are largely based on this book, Exegesis, which is kind of philosophical magnum opus, which is an extraordinarily interesting text. And the line of thought which I was particularly struck by was the kind of what I call the Gnosticism of Philip K. Dick, the idea that the visible world, the tangible world is an illusion created by bad forces, and the true world is elsewhere. And that tendency, that Gnostic tendency, is incredibly powerful and, in a sense, impossible to refuse. I mean, it's what lies behind, the attraction of the Matrix and all those diagnoses. You can see through the pattern of the fiction of the world to the truth. I don't think that's necessarily reactionary or wrong. I think it's misguided, but I can see it and I can grasp it, and I think it has to be experienced. And I think Philip K. Dick is. It was fascinating reading through Exegesis and looking at the extent to which he called himself, or was called a garage philosopher, and the idea of being a garage philosopher who can kind of use what there is to hand, like the 4 volumes of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy that he had, and then he was reading people like Hans Jonas's books on Gnosticism, and trying to kind of put together a really powerful diagnostic picture of reality.
Which version of the exegesis did you read? Because there was one that was published that was just selections from it that had like giraffes on the cover that I own a copy of, and then I think there was another edited version that came out later. Were you responding to I think it was a longer version? I'm not sure, but
this is a huge, like, I don't know, 1,200 page.
Right. Did you read the entirety of that thing, or
I did? I read it in actually in manuscript, because I was asked to do that by Jonathan Lethem, the novelist, who was involved with a group of people that were trying to get this published, and so he commandeered a group of people to write footnotes on Dick's exegesis. So I remember, this is completely kind of Dickian experience. I remember being in Las Vegas, with my ex-wife. We were just kind of wandering around this huge kind of manuscript, and I was leafing through. We're both reading it kind of manically, kind of gorging on it, and I was trying to find ways in to offer some little footnotes. So my job was to kind of elucidate some of the philosophical references he was making.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's I mean, if it's a conspiratorial theory of reality, then there is truth to that. It's not that I don't want to say that conspiracy theories are just wrong, because it is the case that there are forces which shape reality. There are hidden hands controlling things. There are things going on behind the scenes which have to be exposed to the light, and the wool is being pulled over our eyes a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way in which, I guess,
it's a central philosophical insight, isn't it? The difference between appearance and reality. The idea that we have to pierce the common perception of the world and get to what's true underneath. Certainly, it was something that Socrates was engaged.
Oh yeah, but this is the central. I mean, the central image of philosophy, the cave. And if you read that, it's astonishing. You've got prisoners in a cave, and they're manacled in such a way that they can only see directly ahead of them, and they're looking up. Their heads are kind of forced back. They're looking up towards a kind of large parapet, and they can see shadows. And these are shadows, it turns out, of the people up there running the cave, holding up images or puppets or shapes. And so all that they see are the reflections of reflections. And then it's described, I think, in the passive verb in Greek, is not someone is loosened. Someone becomes free. They're not free, they become free, and they ascend out the cave, and then they see illusion for what it is. They see the sun for the first time, and then they go back into the cave, and then they're killed. Because so in that sense, philosophy begins with an idea of we're living in a phantasmagoria of illusion, and that phantasmagoria of illusion is democratic life, and we have to see through that in order to produce something better. Plato's view was government by a group of experts that will be philosophically trained and will actually be able to know what to do, rather than the idea of leaving it to the popular vote, which is completely crazy. Because this is also, I think, a great argument Plato makes, that democracy is, he says, the most many-colored, the brightest and most many-colored of political forms. It's lovely. It's like a Benetton ad from back in the day. But it invites tyranny into democracy. A figure will appear, a popular figure who will seize hold of popular opinion, will get voted into power, and then will begin to distort things on the basis of their will. And that's how. So tyranny doesn't come out of nowhere. Tyranny comes out of democracy, and therefore, in order to get to a better form of government, we have to do away with democracy, which is a kind of unfashionable view. But you have to remember that probably until a philosopher like John Dewey, there was nobody in the history of political thought and philosophical thought that was actually wanted to defend democracy. Democracy was obviously a pretty stupid idea, and because it would lead to all sorts of mob rule and violence and populism, which indeed has proved to be the case. So, what you do with that, I don't know. I think we have to kind of tread carefully. My view is that representative democracy, as it has come to exist in the West, is certainly not the answer. The answer is perhaps forms of association, smaller forms of association, which would be prior to representation. I'm a little bit of an anarchist in that regard, and
so one last
Midtown, oddly enough. There you go.
I feel like we really are coming up to the end here, but I have to ask, and I've interviewed Slavoj Žižek, and I'm kind of a fan of his, but I've never quite understood what your debate with him was really about, and I'm just wondering if can you tell me what that was about?
It was about Leninism versus anarchism. It was about it was a revival of the old debate as to whether the left needs to be autocratic, so that Lenin's argument was that in order to bring about true democracy, we need an elite of some kind. That's in the Bolshevik Party. We need an elite who will be able to guide and shape the popular will. And the idea of leaving this to people to decide, people's councils and groups like that, that was not going to work. So it's the old debate between Leninists, who are Marxists, who are kind of Bismarckians, they're authoritarians, and anarchists, who are just kind of, let's leave it to popular forms of association to decide. It was that old debate, and that's a good debate to have. I mean, should there be is there an argument for an authoritarian left? Slavoj would answer yes, and I would beg to differ, but
my observation would be that we are going to have that Bismarckian society, but only without the left part. We're going to we're having even in the West, we seem to be becoming more and more authoritarian. There's more tamping down on speech. There's more attempts to control free association. Our society, and even people who consider themselves to be liberal, are more open to the idea of just straight up a kind of authoritarian rule, and it has nothing to do with the principles of the left, which I think have primarily to do with freeing people as individuals and collectively, socially. And
I agree. And COVID has given the lie to that, in a sense. COVID has provided the cover for a lot of these tendencies to become sedimented in forms of behavior. Yeah, I think it's really, really alarming. I don't think it's quite, it is up to us, in a way. It's up to us. So yeah. Look, our phones are conspiring against us,
but we can't turn them off. We can program them even. But the phones are conspiring against us. It's a very tricky situation. Yeah. Listen, I appreciate your time, and I'd love to have you back on sometime to talk about whatever you do next, if you would like to. And
I'd love to.
Appreciate you being here. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and click that bell. You should also consider supporting me on Patreon. Patrons get access to a second behind-the-scenes Parrot Room discussion, where we dish out gossip or go into the weeds on topics such as the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, imperialism, and the critical theories of Tiffany Brissett and Donald Most. You'll also get access to both the public and private version of the revised Pop the Left series with Ashley Frawley and Pascal Robert, and the new Zoomer Philosophy series. Your support will not only make content like this possible, it will also help to establish a new publishing venture through Diet Soap Media. Right now, supporting me on Patreon will make a big difference.